In this podcast episode, Nick Shirley shares his intense experience traveling to Cuba amid a severe humanitarian crisis. He discusses the stark realities of life under communism in Cuba, the challenges he faced while filming, and his narrow escape from government scrutiny. The conversation also covers Nick's ongoing investigative journalism work exposing fraud in the United States, particularly involving daycare centers and hospice care, as well as political opposition he has encountered. Additionally, Nick reflects on his growth as an independent journalist, his personal goals, and the complexities of navigating controversial topics in today's media landscape. Nick begins by explaining his motivation to visit Cuba, to document firsthand life under communism, especially as socialism gains momentum in the United States. Despite strong warnings from family and security personnel, he decided to proceed, believing people deserve to see the reality. Accompanied by two experienced security guards fluent in Spanish and accustomed to hostile environments, Nick arrived with proper journalistic documentation. Upon arrival, Cuban authorities confiscated nearly all of his camera equipment, including GoPros and Meta glasses, leaving him to film primarily with an iPhone and a small hidden microphone. He recounts being held for up to 2 hours at the airport, questioned extensively, and having his gear scrutinized like unfamiliar foreign objects. The entire process was reportedly low-tech, with officials relying on pen and paper rather than computers. Throughout his time in Cuba, he and his team were closely followed by government operatives, spies, who were actually civilians monitoring guests to enforce control and stifle dissent. Nick describes the visible signs of decay in Havana, with empty streets, crumbling buildings, and cars predominantly from the 1950s or from China and former Soviet states. The lack of gasoline has rendered gas stations irrelevant, and people face dire shortages of food, medicine, and daily essentials. He shares harrowing reports from locals, with one person saying they had not seen eggs in a year, pointing to the rationing system's failure. Despite these hardships, some older Cubans showed signs of indoctrination by the government, praising the regime's efforts, while others openly expressed despair and a desperate hope for change. Nick emphasizes that many Cubans live in fear of speaking out, often forced to remain silent or cautious due to pervasive surveillance and mutual distrust encouraged by the government. He draws parallels between Cuba and North Korea in terms of social control and the culture of snitching. The hotel where they stayed, a luxury government-run facility, became a trap where they were surrounded by watchers and prevented from freely continuing their work. After just 24 hours, Nick's security team advised an early departure due to escalating risks, including interactions with higher-level officials, such as a 2-star general who demanded explanations for their shortened visit and monitored their departure meticulously. The Cuban government reportedly knew about Nick's presence almost immediately, with information flowing up to the country's president. Nick and his team fled in an electric tricycle to the airport, encountering continued scrutiny. He details how their equipment was returned upon exit, but notes the constant surveillance and intimidation endured. Nick believes the dire economic situation, compounded by the U.S. blockade and Venezuela's inability to supply oil, has left Cuba vulnerable and struggling to maintain control. He speculates on the near future, suggesting a possible U.S. takeover due to Cuba's economic implosion and political instability. Nick discusses pushback from pro-communist individuals, including a man who publicly challenged Nick's claims by recording himself at the same hotel, denying the presence of any Cuban government suppression or surveillance. Nick categorizes this as blatant propaganda aimed at discrediting his work, noting the absurdity when the man uses a generator to charge his phone, inadvertently highlighting resource scarcity. He also references harsh rhetoric from leftist commentators who liken Nick's journalistic efforts to various forms of systemic violence, underscoring the ideological battle his reporting has ignited both inside Cuba and abroad. The conversation shifts to Nick's domestic investigative work, exposing large-scale fraud in childcare and daycare facilities, particularly focusing on the Quality Learning Center in Minneapolis. He details the raid of fraudulent centers, the political resistance encountered, including a failed amendment in Minnesota to cut funding, and the suspicious silence or evasiveness of local politicians such as Ilhan Omar around these scandals. Nick alleges nepotism, corruption, and marriage irregularities linked to Omar and calls for her prosecution or deportation. In California, Nick has faced legislative pushback, including a bill dubbed the Stop Nick Shirley Act, authored by the wife of the state's attorney general, which aims to criminalize investigative actions against nonprofits perceived as harassment. Nick warns this bill threatens First Amendment rights by potentially making it illegal to expose fraud through recording or public investigation, framing the bill as a shield protecting fraudulent operations. Nick shares chilling stories from his investigations into healthcare fraud, especially hospice care, where providers allegedly exploit Medicare by using the identities of terminal patients to bill massive amounts while living lavish lifestyles. He exposes daycare centers operating illegally out of apartments without proper supervision or children present, receiving millions in government funding despite red flags and lack of accountability. These investigations reveal systemic abuse of public funds with little oversight. Nick underscores the frustration that these businesses continue operating despite exposure and that authorities often attempt to silence or intimidate him instead of addressing the fraud. Nick recounts his experiences documenting the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles, especially in Skid Row, illustrating the human suffering and government inefficacy despite significant funding. He highlights vulnerable populations, including children living on the streets engulfed in drug and crime-ridden environments, contrasting this with government agencies that enable ongoing drug use rather than addressing root causes. Nick expresses concern about the city's readiness for major events like the 2028 Olympics, calling attention to poor public safety planning and the growing crisis that residents endure daily yet remains unaddressed. Nick reveals how he meticulously planned his career with a 5-year strategy, starting with small savings, rebuilding his YouTube channel, and scaling to create a media company with employees. Despite offers from major media outlets, Nick prefers to remain independent, valuing freedom of content and control over his work amid increasing threats from radicalized individuals targeted by his investigations. He discusses balancing growing responsibilities, extensive travel, security costs, and the desire to create a documentary and possibly write a book. Nick emphasizes that his faith, family support, and a commitment to transparency fuel his resilience in facing opposition from both political adversaries and those incriminated by his reporting. Nick touches on notable incidents where public figures like Candace Owens have questioned or criticized his work, specifically regarding investigative videos in Brazil and conspiracy theories. He remains unbothered by such criticism, emphasizing his commitment to uncovering truth through on-the-ground journalism. He also contrasts himself with other journalists, noting emotional stability, sincerity, and genuine curiosity as factors differentiating his approach, while highlighting the importance of choosing trustworthy advisors and sponsors as his platform grows. Looking ahead, Nick expresses a desire to continue expanding his reporting into areas like Venezuela and potentially even countries with extreme restrictions, such as Iran or North Korea, although access remains a significant barrier. He reveals some personal aspirations, including finding a virtuous, faith-driven life partner and settling down before age 30. Nick portrays himself as motivated not only by professional success, but also faith, family, and a sense of mission to reveal uncomfortable truths that authorities or mainstream media often ignore or suppress.